Hello and welcome to this Thursday's morning market briefing. We've got lots to talk about, but firstly, far-right Israeli ministers pile pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu over the truce which is currently in place, as well as that Rishi Sunak dismisses talks of Britain rejoining the EU. But we've got a lot to talk about on the charts also, with lots happening on the economic calendar, but we'll come to that near the end, so make sure you stay around until you see that. Before we get straight into it, make sure to subscribe. But the first article to talk about, of course, is the far-right Israeli ministers which are putting pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, far-right Israeli ministers have piled pressure onto Netanyahu to reject any further truce, and this comes as talks continue over extending the temporary truce with Hamas and Israel. Now, we've been talking about this a lot, covering it extensively, largely as a result of the fact that it is highly impactful to many markets, but most importantly gold, which obviously is a safe haven asset, and therefore when world tensions rise, as with this current geopolitical conflict, we then do start to see the effects of that on gold, with gold's price generally going up. And we've seen that not only with this war since it did start, and now gold's reaching new highs, but we also saw the exact same after Russia invaded Ukraine. So that's why it's so important to stay on top of these geopolitical conflicts. But yes, we've been covering this greatly. We did enter this ceasefire last Friday, and since then we have seen an exchange of hostages. Originally we were kind of apprehensive to whether the kind of process of exchanging the Palestinian prisoners for Israeli hostages to be successful and peaceful, but so far it has seemingly been quite good, with it being peaceful so far. But we have seen an extension now take place to this ceasefire, and many far-right Israeli ministers want to stop giving back Palestinian authorities. Want Israel to stop giving back those Palestinian prisoners, and in place of that, go back to the conflict, where they can instead rescue the hostages that have been taken, rather than make deals with the Palestinian Authority or Hamas in relation to them. And that's kind of the push from these Israeli ministers. But at the same time, we are receiving that pressure, or at least Netanyahu is receiving that pressure from the hostages' families, which ultimately are trying to avoid this conflict, because it's the most likely way that the hostages and their family would end up being killed. As we do know that many of the hostages that have been taken already have passed away, either that being killed or dying in an airstrike, or being murdered, and therefore we're in a tough situation where Benjamin Netanyahu has to manage those pressures from both sides, as the far-right Israeli ministers are within his own government, and he needs to hold on to those allies. Now, 2 cabinet ministers have said the government was under threat if a more ambitious swap with Hamas was pursued, and this came as Hamas were expected to release 12 Israeli hostages in return for 30 Palestinian prisoners. And shadows recently, however, have been cast over discussions with Qatar, as Qatar has been the main broker in these discussions. Qatar has its links to Hamas, with Hamas having its political administration and offices within the territory of Gaza, and therefore Qatar's been able to operate as a broker. Now, following claims for Hamas that a 10-month-old baby, which was being held hostage, and 2 other family members have been killed. And this is obviously what we were just talking about in relation to the fact that we are in this situation where Benjamin Netanyahu is receiving that pressure from both sides, where certain individuals want the ceasefire to end, because ultimately it's enabling, I guess, certain Hamas groups and other Palestinian militant groups within Gaza, which are holding hostages, to strengthen, kind of embed themselves even greater into the infrastructure, and as a result make it harder for the IDF to clear that territory, as the ultimate goal of the IDF, as stated by Netanyahu, is to clear Gaza from Hamas, and therefore they're in a tough situation with as we're seeing here with this baby dying as a result of the conflict. Those families which have a relation to the hostages obviously don't want this conflict to continue taking place, and they want their family home. And that's the tough situation to deal with the truce, the current truce agreement taking effect last Friday, but now has the potential to be extended to 10 days, with there also being discussions about a broader deal that would require Israel to halt its offensive and release large numbers of Palestinian prisoners, including those convicted of murder, which would be highly controversial, especially within Benjamin Netanyahu's government, which would likely be very much against that. But then again, you have to question how far are these hostage families willing to go. If it was your kind of brother and sister, and they were being held hostage, and you had the option to get them out if you were to exchange them for a murderer, then that you're in that situation of having to choose between that, and I'm sure many would choose that exchange just because they want their family. And as we do know, as I just stated with the 10-month-old baby, many of these hostages are able to die within Gaza, of course, whether that be being killed by the militant groups or by crossfire with Israeli strikes. And so it's a tough situation for both sides, which are pressuring Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, there's also been discussions about a broader deal that would require Israel to halt its offensive and release large numbers of Palestinian prisoners, including murderers, as I said. And in return, Israel would not only receive more civilian hostages, but soldiers as well. And this is something very important to note, because we haven't actually heard any talks thus far in relation to soldiers being released. Up to this point, we've only heard talks around women and children, and those are the only hostages which have been released so far, with soldiers kind of being looked at as something that would take place further at the end, and requiring a greater deal of negotiating power and leverage, and therefore requiring more Palestinian prisoners to be released for every one Israeli soldier to be released. Now, Netanyahu, however, said Israel would resume its campaign after this short ceasefire, also saying there is no situation in which we would not go back to fighting until the end. But that said, Netanyahu is also facing pressure from hostage families to extend the truce. So keep your eyes on this, as it is affecting markets around the world. Next to talk about, though, is Rishi Sunak, who has dismissed those talks of Britain rejoining the EU. Now, Rishi Sunak has quashed suggestions that the direction of travel is for Britain to rejoin the EU. And when Sunak was asked on whether he believed Britain might rejoin, his spokesman said he was focused on delivering the benefits of Brexit, and he believed in it passionately, with Sunak also attacking his Greek counterpart in a row over the so-called Elgin marbles, saying Mitsotakis, I haven't pronounced that right, I'm so sorry, had chosen to grandstand on the issue of a visit to London. Now, we've been covering, Rishi Sunak's Prime Minister, as a Prime Minister quite extensively. Sorry, my English poor today, but yeah, we've been covering him quite extensively in relation to his policies, and most recently we covered Jeremy Hunt implementing, or at least promising to implement, the new tax cuts for the British public. But Sunak has been taking this kind of strange line within politics and foreign policy of kind of trying to find his way around the populist structures which have been left by leaders such as Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, where Rishi Sunak, who is a Eurosceptic, has introduced kind of a pro-European minister now, that being ex-Prime Minister David Cameron, into his cabinet, whilst also presenting himself, as we see here, as the anti-EU kind of guy. And so we're kind of in this weird situation of what is Rishi Sunak trying to present himself, and obviously this is as we go into next year's election. So the question is, how will Sunak kind of balance this line, especially now he has Lord Cameron in his cabinet, with Greece wanting artifacts such as the Parthenon sculptures returned to Greece, with opposition leader Starmer confronting him by saying Sunak was willing to burn a relationship with a NATO ally for the sake of a headline, with Labour now seeing this row as a way for Sunak to divert attention away from his failing immigration policy in the UK. And the kind of immigration policy that we have been seeing within the UK, has been one of great contention and great discussion, with this being a key issue as we do go into 2024, with it actually being a kind of policy which now Starmer has changed his position on quite greatly, going from quite a pro-immigration, pro-EU kind of guy, and responding to the Conservatives' attacks on the Red Wall territories following the Brexit referendum. Starmer is now adjusting his position to that and actually aligning himself more with that kind of old Boris Johnson rhetoric that we used to hear. And so it's interesting to see how this is playing out, with the timing of the row being made more awkward by the fact that Cameron has not been appointed. Cameron has been appointed as Foreign Secretary in a move to bolster British foreign policy, with Cameron last week saying he was determined to work closely with Brussels, that being obviously the EU headquarters, with the European Commission Vice President now expected to meet Cameron on Wednesday. But the row has raised thoughts that criticising pro-EU figures could win political mileage going into next year's election. So keep your eyes on the topic of not only the US elections, which will take place next year, but also on British elections, as these will both be affecting their respective currencies. So keep your eyes on them. Next to talk about, though, is the charts, with the first kind of asset to talk about, of course, being US indices. Now, here on the US 30, obviously yesterday we were actually talking more so about how the US 30 was struggling around this area of resistance and liquidity. And as we had noted with this kind of bearish divergence on the RSI, we were warning of a possible reversal for the US 30 to make a run to the downside. That said, going into yesterday, it does seem that price was able to break above it. But the way price action is still presenting itself, we can't necessarily say it's out of the clear yet. With, if you just look here, this is kind of all very low momentum moves, and with this kind of bearish divergence still on our mind, we really will have to wait until we see some really significant moves to the upside before we can say, the US 30 is set for a good move to bullish. So keep your eyes on this. Next to talk about, though, is the dollar, which has continued to the downside most recently, as we noted yesterday. But that said, at the moment, and after yesterday's performance, dollar has kind of consolidated after pushing to the downside, and has failed to take a significant move lower. And so we're kind of in an interesting position now with the dollar, whereby we're trying to see where price can go. Obviously, we need to be listening out for any economic data to understand whether the dollar can continue making lows, as the main headline that we did talk about yesterday was the fact that the dollar had reached 3-month lows. So keep your eyes on this. Euro dollar is the next to talk about, so still on the topic of the dollar, but euro dollar is kind of an interesting one to talk about at the moment, largely because it's kind of retesting this area of liquidity and support that we have seen form at those prior highs on Tuesday the 21st of November. And so the question is, with price now spiking into these levels, will we see price run away from it after gaining the liquidity and possibly making a run up to this Fibonacci extension level that we have highlighted before? So keep your eyes on euro dollar. Next to talk about, though, is pound yen, which, like other currencies, is kind of retesting this area of liquidity that we're seeing here. That said, this was a more broad area of liquidity. It was more of a broad kind of area which we said, there's lots of orders. If we look back to when we did draw it out, as you can see here, it was kind of the peak of the market. But it is interesting to see that we're now retesting those areas. And as we can see here, those wicks on the candles are spiking into that area of liquidity, signifying that it is an area of support and where money is stored, and therefore it's likely that price could make a move away from it. But at the same time, this kind of bearish divergence did create a negative bearish image in our heads around where pound yen may go. So keep your eyes on this. Next to talk about though is USD JPY, which has failed to kind of make a move lower, as we can see here with this kind of area of support and liquidity, and we did note yesterday that price was moving closer and closer to it. But coming into yesterday's session, it does seem that price failed to actually make a move below it, and instead has kind of returned back above those prior lows, kind of somewhat below it. But ultimately, price has failed to make a significant move to the downside. At the same time, we could kind of be retesting price, but it'll be interesting to see what sort of momentum we can see come out of this. As if we do look on the RSI, as I bring it up here, you can see actually that we are having that bullish divergence, and therefore signaling to us the chance of price making a run to the upside. So keep your eyes out for this. Next talk about though is Bitcoin, which was ranging for some time now, but as we noted in yesterday's market briefing, we did note that that the market was kind of trying to push price above this area of resistance, but like we noted, there was a strong chance of this false breakout happening once again, and that is exactly what we have seemingly seen. And we can see this here with price now returning back below that area of resistance. So keep your eyes on Bitcoin. Next talk about though is gold, which has reached this kind of area of resistance that we spoke about, with gold taking a significant move to the upside, but now it's kind of stalling out. Obviously we could be just gaining that momentum, that liquidity once again, to continue a move to the upside. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out on gold. That's all to talk about though on the charts. Lastly to talk about, of course, is the economic calendar, where we actually do have quite a bit of data coming out today. So make sure you listen out and look out for all of this. Now, firstly, we will have Chinese manufacturing data. We know China's been struggling recently, and as is forecast, we are expecting a contraction once again. But that said, we're expecting higher levels of manufacturing than previous. So listen out for this. As well as that, we will have Japanese consumer confidence figures being released, along with German and Swiss retail sales data. So listen out for that to kind of gain a better understanding of where inflation could go for France, for Germany and Switzerland, of course, as retail sales is a large part of consumption within an economy, which plays in part to inflation, of course. As well as that, we are receiving French and Italian inflation rate figures. That's very important, as that all plays into the ECB's overall inflation rate, and therefore interest rate, as monetary policy is shaped around the inflation rate. So listen out for that most definitely. So as that, we will have German and Italian unemployment rate. That obviously plays into monetary policy as well. So listen out for that. Along with that, we will also have Canadian unemployment figures being released as well, along with, and most importantly, we will have the Eurozone's inflation rate being released as well, and that will be very, very, very important. So make sure you listen out for that, as that will be playing part to shaping up, of course, the ECB's monetary policy. And so looking out for this is very important. We're forecasting a 3.9% level. And last month we did actually come in below expectations. So maybe that happens again this month. So listen out for that. As well as that, we will have the ECB's President Lagarde speaking, as that will be very interesting to hear following, obviously, this inflation rate being released. And as well as that, we will have some US inflation data being released as well. So listen out for that, of course. But that's all to talk about on the economic calendar. We've covered lots on the articles, lots on the charts, and lots on the economic calendar. That's all from us at Wildwood Capital. Have a great trading day. See you later. Bye.